It's no secret that Dragon Quest XI is one of the best JRPGs of the past generation, and perhaps of all time. Its dedication to and belief in its traditional structure and gameplay loop leaves it as one of the most confidently consistent games in its entire genre. 11 was the game that got me, a lifelong Final Fantasy fanatic, into Dragon Quest, and I have since devoured every game in the over 30-year-old franchise. As I quickly learned when playing through the series, pretty much each numbered entry has multiple versions. Whether those be remakes or re-releases, it's hard to tell which is the definitive version of each game. DQ11 basically sidesteps this issue entirely, as its definitive edition literally has the words Definitive Edition in its title, so any confusion should stop there. However, whilst Dragon Quest XI-S does have both 2D and the original 3D art styles, English and new Japanese voiceovers, and plenty of quality of life improvements, it does not encompass all that could be labelled Dragon Quest XI. There is one art style that this definitive edition leaves out. An art style from a version of the game that many fans don't even know exists. I'm talking about Dragon Quest XI for the 3DS. Before we get on with it, please like this video, comment any thoughts you have down below, and subscribe to the Any Button to Start channel. At DQ11's original Japanese launch in 2017, two versions of the game were released. The flagship PS4 exclusive edition that would later see a release worldwide, and the less publicised, never-to-be-translated 3DS version. Yes, day and date with the state-of-the-art Unreal Engine 4 utilising PS4 game, Square Enix released an officially sanctioned demake of that very game. In fact, that demake outsold the PS4 version in Japan by about 400,000 copies, so why wasn't it brought to the West alongside its bigger brother? Well, despite the fact that Nintendo had already launched the Switch by the time DQ11 was released and were winding down their support for the 3DS, the dual-screen handheld was still wildly popular and ubiquitous within Japan, in a way it just wasn't in the rest of the world. The Japanese gamer has historically valued the portability of handhelds far more than their Western counterparts, and seeing as the PS4 was not selling nearly as much in Japan as it was elsewhere, Square likely created the 3DS version to make sure as many people as possible could play this latest entry in the country's favourite series. On the other hand, 3DS usage in the West had basically become non-existent as soon as the Switch dropped, and the PS4 was quickly becoming one of the best-selling consoles of all time, so when localizing the game for the rest of the world, Square Enix probably thought that translating the 3DS version was more trouble than it was worth. Now, you've read the title and heard what I have had to say thus far and are probably wondering why I'm about to tell you to play this version of the game that is far less accessible than the one you're probably familiar with. Well, if you read the title again, you'll see that I specified that I believe people should replay Dragon Quest XI with the 3DS version. I don't think, especially for those who don't speak Japanese, that DQ11 should first be experienced on the 3DS, and if you're interested in playing this fantastic role-playing game for the first time, you should definitely check out the S Definitive Edition. However, for those of you in the audience already familiar with Dragon Quest XI and with at least one playthrough under your belt, the 3DS edition is a fascinating way to revisit this masterpiece. Despite following the exact same story and general sequence of events as the HD version, Dragon Quest XI for the 3DS has a multitude of differences from its bigger brother. including many that highlight the meticulous game design at the heart of the DQ11 experience. The most striking difference, of course, is the graphical style. Whilst the HD version runs on Unreal Engine 4 and employs modern graphical techniques, rendering environments that are grand in scale and scope with somewhat realistic lighting and reflections, the 3DS version runs on hardware severely less powerful than the target of its counterpart, so some serious concessions had to be made. The 3DS game presents low-poly, chibi-style character models, usually with flat-textured features. The environments are similarly pared back, and that goes for towns and the overworld, with most 3DS areas being noticeably smaller than their HD equivalents. The dungeon design is much simpler as well, and the game has less puzzle gimmicks and such overall. You may be assuming a slight negative implication from my listing out of the game's pared back features like this, and whilst of course when it comes to getting the full experience from Dragon Quest XI, I still recommend the S Definitive Edition for first time players, I also believe that for returning fans it will be that very pared downedness that will serve as this version's selling point. The smaller scale of Dragon Quest XI's 3DS adaptation makes for a more fast-paced and further crystallized version of the HD game's story and world. Events follow each other much more quickly on the 3DS than they do in the HD version, without long gaps between plot points, and the story feels much more gripping and engaging as a consequence. The smaller environments and overworld probably contribute to this feeling too, though more noticeably, their condensed nature serves to highlight the functionalism of their design. Within the overworld at least, most areas have the same fundamental layout, just smaller scale within this 3DS version. When traversing these miniaturized versions of the larger game's areas, a player can more obviously see the lines of sight set out by the level designers. The way in which these environments subtly and subliminally push players towards the next objective through their design is much clearer when experienced at this smaller scale. These shrunken areas with their clear directional signalling go a long way to expediting the drawn-out walks of the HD game. Of course, the thing I'm leaving out of my criteria when judging the merits of the 3DS version is the sense of atmosphere and place created by the larger environments and more detailed graphical presentation of the HD version. When first playing and falling in love with Dragon Quest XI, it was that level of explorable detail that pushed my enjoyment of the game over the edge into the territory of worship. So, I wouldn't dare tell you, dear viewer, that the convenience of the speedier nature of this smaller port could ever replace the wonder of the larger one. And that is why I specified that the 3DS title is best for replays, and best when viewed in contrast to the larger game, as an example of abstraction. The developers of this 3DS edition took the minute details and grand vision of the PS4 game and had to begin a tense match of game designers' Jenga. They had to remove as many pieces as possible of that detail and scale from the tower of that larger game, until they were left with its lightest form. A structure that still stood tall as recognisably Dragon Quest XI, though stripped down from top to bottom to fit onto the 3DS. This process is rarely seen applied to such a high-profile game as Dragon Quest XI, and it's even rarer to see the original developers tackling it, as demakes of this sort are usually relegated to the realm of fan projects. So, Dragon Quest XI for the 3DS, even through its untranslated language barrier, is a treat for anyone who has played the more famous version of the game, and has an interest in these sorts of game designerly exercises in restrained adaptation. For someone like me, currently trying to study the true heart of the JRPG genre, this version of Dragon Quest XI has been a fascinating door into the minds of the game's makers, and also, of course, one hell of an adventure. Thank you for getting to the end of the video, dear viewer. Before you go, please like the video, comment any thoughts you have down below, and subscribe to the Any Button to Start channel. And until next time. Fulcrum, come in. Yodi gang.